Hello everyone, welcome back. In previous lecture, we have enabled Spring Security to our web application, and also Spring Security by default it is providing basic authentication and also default login and logout web pages. Right? So in this lecture, we are going to implement how we can customize Spring configurations in our web application. So in previous lecture we have used basic authentication which is provided by Spring Security by default. So now we are going to implement how we can customize Spring Security configurations. Learning Spring Boot security is very easy, guys. Most of the people are struggling to learn Spring Security because of there is a lag of understanding the concept. So I will explain you in very easy way so that you guys will never forget Spring Security concepts. So I will summarize Spring Security execution internal flow. You can see once user send a request, so request will come to authentication filter, and authentication filter will use authentication manager, and authentication manager will use authentication provider to validate user details, sorry, user credentials, right? So there are several authentication filters involved during the execution internally, so that I will explain you later. So as of now you remember authentication filter. Okay, so and also there are several authentication providers are available in the market. So what are those? Spring Boot security by default it is providing in-memory authentication provider, and also there are different database layer. Data authentication provider will connect to the database layer to validate credentials, and also there are LDAP system, and also Active Directory. Those are all comes under authentication provider. So depends on your requirement, you can use your own authentication provider which are needed to your web application or RESTful web services. So since currently we are using form based authentication, right? So we have enabled Spring Security to our web application. So later I will explain you how we can enable Spring Security to our RESTful API, and also how we can implement basic authentications to our RESTful web services. So now let me create the class to customize Spring Security configurations. We can write our own customization class to provide basic authentication. We'll see what all the things we can do by writing custom class, custom Spring basic authentication class. So now go to our project directory and right click on the project and create package called security. Second, no, so we have to right click on root package of our web application. Right click on root package of web application and create package called security. So inside the security package we'll create one class, new class, custom security configuration. You can give any name, guys. Okay, custom security configuration, or your application related name you can give Spring Web application security configuration. So depends on your requirement, you can name it your application class name. Okay, so click on finish button. Now so the moment we enable Spring Security to our web application, once we add the dependency in pom.xml. So let me open the pom.xml to summarize you. So here you can see in pom.xml we have added Spring Boot starter security dependency. The moment we add dependency, we no need to write any code to to implement basic authentication. So Spring Security by default will provide us basic authentication that we already seen in previous lecture. Who are all watching newly, you can subscribe Java Cafeteria channel and you can learn Spring Boot from scratch. Okay, so now in this lecture we are going to customize Spring Security configuration. So we have created the class. So here, if you want to create our Spring Security configuration, custom Spring Security configuration, so we have to create a class and we have to declare that class as a @configuration annotation. So the moment we declare that configuration annotation, during the server startup, this class is being executed and all the beans which we are configured inside this custom class will be initialized during the runtime. So now from here, so many people are having confusion. So how we can customize Spring configuration or basic authentication class? So many people are by-heading the code. So if you by-head the code, so you cannot remember in lifetime. And also if any requirement may comes in different ways. So based on that, you have to create your custom user defined security configuration class. So most of the people will by-head the code. So here I will teach you, you no need to by-head the code. Without doing that, how you can remember in lifetime and how you can write your own custom security configuration. So let me open notepad plus plus to explain you in very easy way. So if you want to write your custom security configuration class, first what you have to do, you have to declare, create a package first, security package, create security package in your web application. So the package name can be anything here, config package or security package. Since we are going to implement Spring Security configuration, so that's the reason I'm naming package name as create security package name your web application that we just have created, right? There is a package security package, right? So after that, what you have to do, next second step, you have to create simple Java class and declare that class as configuration configuration annotation. So that's it. So now from here, original story will start now. So from here, so many people are having confusion. So no need to buy hard the code. Okay, I will explain you very simple manner. So after creating these these two steps, so next what you have to do, the very first, let me start the application and let me explain you basic authentication how it is working. So we are in previous lecture we have configured our own static credentials in application dot properties, right? So by using these credentials we are logging into our web application by using Spring Security form based authentication. So let me start the server. Yeah, server started successfully. You can see our server started successfully. Now go to the browser and type localhost colon 8080, click enter. So see, it is directly logging into, directly opening login page. This login page is provided by Spring Security by default. We haven't written any JSP, login JSP. So the moment you add the dependency in pom.xml, so whenever you are adding dependency in pom.xml, Spring Security dependency in pom.xml, so by default, all the APIs which we have written in our web application will be secured by default. So all the APIs or all the URLs which we have declared in our web application will be by default all are secured. So Spring Security will provide basic authentication. So if you want to who are all watching newly, you can watch previous videos. Okay. So now here, so the moment user enter credential, which credentials we have to use? So in previous lecture we have added static credentials in application.properties. Otherwise, if you don't declare this one, so Spring Security will provide default password to login our web application. So instead of that, we have created static credentials in application.properties. By using these credentials, we can log in, right? So let me use Java cafeteria and password name is set test. So here what we are doing, very first step is we are trying to access the authenticating the web application. Nothing but we can call technically request. So we are authorizing the request, entering the credentials, and click on signing button is nothing but we are going to authenticate to our web application. Once you click on sign in button, so now we are able to see our user registration web page. So the very first step is authenticate. We have to authenticate first, so you have to remember. So for that, the third step, we have to authenticate request. Remember, authenticate request. So you have to remember in that way. So the step we have done in web application very fast, entering the username and password is nothing but we have to authenticate to our web application. So this is the first step, authenticate requests. So next, another step is, so after that, so once you authenticated, so after that, what kind of authentication? First, you have to write the logic. What kind of authentication? Here we have done web-based authentication, form-based authentication, right? In previous lecture, I already explained you there are different ways are there. So form-based authentication and HTTP basic authentication. So since we are using here web application, we have to use form-based authentication. So then you have to write the logic to implement form-based authentication. So remember these two steps very first. To write custom security configuration, you have to remember these two steps. So while entering the username and password, for that we are going to authenticating the request. Technically we can call it as a authenticating the request, authenticate request, entering username and password in login page, that is nothing but authenticate requests. And second, next step, what we have to do, we are doing form based authentication. Form based authentication, nothing but, so earlier what we have done, in login page we are just entering the username and credential by using web page. This is nothing but form based authentication. So that is the meaning of this fourth step. So form based authentication. So first step will be authenticate request, and next form based authentication. These two things we have to write in our custom configuration class. So now let's see how what we are going to do. So during the Spring Security flow, I told you, right, first request where it will come. So the moment user send the request, so request will come to authentication filter, right? So that is nothing but there is a default filter security filter chain. So there is a Spring provided default security filter chain that we have to use, right? So now go to our custom security configuration class, and if you just go to filter, that authentication filter is having filter chain method. What is that method? Filter chain method, remember it. So filter chain method. Let me stop the server, later we'll start the server once we implement it. So first step you have to do, authentication filter is having a method called filter chain. So filter chain method, just write it here. So this filter chain method will have, so the request, very first I told, right, we have to authorize the request. To authorize the what kind of request it is? HTTP request, right? Just remember, HTTP request. So entering credentials in web browser and submitting the sign in button is a HTTP request, right? So now for our request we are going to provide security. Remember in that way. For our HTTP request we are going to provide security. So that is nothing but HTTP security. So remember in that way. So now this filter chain method will have HTTP security argument, HTTP parameter HTTP security. So this method will return. So as of now let me create void. So let's declare it as a void only. So authentication field during our Spring Security execution flow, request will come to authentication filter, right? So authentication filter will have filter chain method that we are going to customize it now. So filter chain method we have written it, and this is having HTTP security parameter. So why HTTP security parameter? Earlier it is a simple HTTP request, entering credential and submitting it a simple HTTP request. Now we are going to provide security to our web application. We are going to secure our HTTP request. That is nothing but HTTP request. We can call it as a security, HTTP security. Here we have to use HTTP security. So that we need to pass it as filter chain method argument. That's it. So now after that, what I told, we have to authenticate requests. So authenticate request. So the HTTP security object is having authorize request. There is a method called authorize request. You can see th authorize. See, there is a method called authorize HTTP request. Just call that method. So what is the step we have to do? Authenticating request, nothing but, so we have to call HTTP request dot authorize request. So after that authorize request dot, so any request, as of now I am going to give access to all the requests. So any, by default all the requests will be secure, so any request can access. So any request dot, so what we have to do? Authenticated. So just click on authenticated method. So that's it. So this will HTTP security dot authorize request dot any request dot authenticated. So this will throw exception actually, so we have to handle that exception. So this method is throwing exception, so that we need to handle by add throws declaration. That's it. So this step we have taken care. So now what is the first step? Authenticating the request. So that is what I have done it here, very first step. HTTP security dot authorize request dot any request dot authenticate. Any request, nothing but what are all the requests which are coming to our web application will be authenticated. That is the meaning of this statement. Any request which is coming to our web application will be authenticated. That nothing but, so any URL which we are going to use in our web application, all the URIs will be authenticated. Without authentication user cannot access user registration form, right? So now that is the meaning of that. You can see here there is a warning is nothing but it is deprecated. You can see this method authorize request from the type HTTP security has been deprecated since version Spring Security version 6.1. So we are using, if you go to your Maven dependencies, we are using Spring core module, Spring Security core module 6 version. You can see here Spring Security 6.2 we are using. So latest version of Spring Security we are using currently. So that's the reason this authorized request is outdated. So in Spring Security 6 onwards, 6.1 onwards, they have introduced lambda expressions. I will explain you later how we can write the code in Spring Security 6 version. So as of now, let it be as is. So earlier Spring Security 3.0 onwards, before 3.0 and 3.0 onwards, we used to write authorize request dot any request authenticated. So this is how we have to write before Spring Security 6 version. So now this is the first step we have done. So second step, what we have to do, we have to do form based authentication. Since we are using web application, we have to use form based authentication. You remember in that way. Next, second step, form based authentication. HTTP security dot, there is a method called form login. That's it. So after that, these are all the two steps if you do. So by default we are customizing our Spring Security configuration. So now you can see this. Now after that we have to build our HTTP security object. So dot, there is a method build, it will return default security filter chain. So just click on that default security filter chain. So this build method is returning uh, default Spring Security filter chain. So let me return it back. So default FAULT, default Spring Security filter chain. That's it. So now this we have to return it back, right? So write it as a return statement. That's it. Our customs filter chain method is ready now. So now here you can see, if you open default Spring Security filter chain, internally again it is implementing security filter chain. Some people may have written, you can see there some people they will directly return this one, Spring Security filter chain. You can return this as well. Instead of default security filter chain, you can return security filter chain as well, that you can import Control Shift O. So most of the people will use Spring Security filter chain. So either default security filter chain or security filter chain you can return. Okay. So now, so this one we have to declare it as a bin. Why? Because this is our Spring Security custom configuration, right? So this will executed during the runtime while server startup, this configuration file is being executed. So how we can create this bin class object? So we can create by specifying at the rate bean annotation. What does it mean? When we have to use at the rate bean annotation, this annotation we have to use during the runtime to create object initialization of Spring Security filter chain. So security filter chain, to initialize this object during the runtime, we have to declare it as a at the rate bean annotation. So that's it. So now let me start the application. Very simple, guys. Now by default all our Spring Security, sorry, all our APIs which we have declared in our web application, all are secured by default. Now that we are using our custom own security configuration. So some people may have doubts, sir, how do we know whether really Spring Boot is using our own custom security configuration? How we can confirm? So let me confirm you that. Stop the server and let me put breakpoint here, and I am keeping breakpoint here, and now let me start the server in debug mode, so that you will get to know during the runtime our own custom security configuration is being executed. Let me start the server in debug mode. So now you can see during the runtime our custom security configuration will be executed. You got it right. See, I just run in debug mode, our custom security configuration class is being executed during the runtime. So once this statement is executed by default, so without writing this code as well, by default all the APIs are secured by default. But now we are securing our web application by using our own custom security configuration by default. Okay, so now now let me execute function F6. It will go to next statement. So form based authentication, we are going to use form based login. So next it will execute, and then it will return security filter chain. So that's it. Now function F8. So now our application is using our own custom security configuration. So this is, you just skip the execution. That's it. This is Eclipse issue, you don't need to bother about it. So now you can see you got confirmed, right? So now our application is using our custom string security configuration. So later I will customize this. Let me check whether it is really securing or not. Our application, open our web page again, click 8080. See, directly it is going to log into our web page. Not only this URL, any URL if you call, let me go to user controller. If I want to call directly save user, we'll see what will happen. Just copy this URL, open in new tab. If user is trying to directly access, if user try to directly access save user API, what will happen? Click on enter. See, it is directly launching login page. So that means all the APIs which we are declaring in our web application will be secured by default. See now, let me try find by email also. Let me call find by email also. Localhost 8080 slash find by email. Click on enter. See, it is directly trying to open login page. So it is not allowing to access any API in our web application. If you want to access any API in our web application, so you must authenticate by default, since we have enabled Spring Security to our web application. So 8080, click on enter. So it is, if you access your application without authenticating it, our application will not allow to access any of the APIs or any of the web URLs. So now before writing custom exception, custom security configuration also same behavior. So but now what is the difference? Now we are using our own custom security configuration. So this one, uh, let me customize few URLs. For example, in our user controller, using basic authentication, we can customize which URL to provide access or which URL to provide without access. So for example, let me create some sample APIs as well to make you more understand. So let me create sample APIs to make you more understand. We are going to customize our our own custom security configuration, and we are going to provide few APIs people can access directly, and few APIs people cannot access directly without authentication. For that purpose, let me write few simple get APIs, get mapping, Control Shift O. Okay, so now, sorry, get mapping, right? So get mapping imported, and this I will give, for example, test uh, test method one. So let me stop the server, otherwise whenever you are modifying the code, it will execute again and again, right? It will try to restart again and again if you modify the code. Let me stop the server. So now, uh, test API, test API 1 or test API 1. Okay, so I will give URL as test API 1. So let me this will return some simple test APIs, guys. uh, Let me return, this is test API 1. I will write a test API authenticated authenticated. Okay, and then similarly let me create few more to make you more understanding. So test API 2 and test API 3 and test API 4, and then let me change the API name as well, test API 2 and test API 3 and test API 4. So that's it. So this is test API 1 authenticated, test API 2 authenticated, test API 3 authenticated, and test API 4 authenticated. So now I am going to customize our Spring Security configuration to provide access to few APIs. If you want to access these two APIs as a authentication, so without authentication people should not access these two APIs. So remaining two APIs we can customer can directly access without authenticating it. So how we can customize that? So let me do it. I hope you guys are understood, right? So we are going to customize now all the APIs. How we are going to customize? So these two APIs only few people can access without, sorry, few people can access only with authentications. All the people can access these two APIs with authentication, and all the customers can directly access these two APIs without authentication. So these two APIs are with authentication and these two APIs are without authentication. How we can customize? So let me show you now. So here there is a method called HTTP security is having authenticate request, right? So instead of any request, what I will do, so there is a method called request matchers. There is a method called request matchers. So here we have to declare which API you can provide you access, which API you are not providing, you are not providing access, which you are, sorry, which API you are providing access and which API you are not providing access. Those things we can define with the request matchers method. So dot authenticated. So what are all the APIs? If you declare here, only those APIs should be authenticated. So let me declare for the time being test API 1. So test API 1. So let me go to configuration call test API 1 should be authenticated. So I am declaring it as authenticated. You can declare as many number of APIs which you want to provide authentication. So similarly let me provide test API to also authentication. So these two APIs, if any user want to access these two APIs, they have to must authenticate first. So now let me provide remaining APIs are not authenticated, not to authenticate. So here test API 3, copy this and paste it here, and similarly copy third API. Sorry. So what is that meaning of that? These two first test API 1 and test API 2 should be authenticated, and test API 3 and test API 4 should not authenticate. What we have to do? There is a method called permit all. Permit all nothing but we are providing access to these two APIs, no need to authenticate. Any customer, they can directly access these two APIs without authentication. That is the meaning of permit all. So first statement should be authenticated. That is nothing but without authenticated, these two APIs, none of the users cannot use directly without authentication. That is the meaning of this first statement. And second statement should be without authentication can access these two APIs. Let me try that. So now let me start the server in normal mode. I don't want to debug now, so let me start the server. That's it. Server started successfully. So now go to your browser. Let me close as of now all the opened ones, and localhost colon 8080 slash. Now what I will do, I want to access test API 1. So test API 1 is must authenticated, so it should not allow us directly to access test API 1, right? So now go to our web browser and try to access this API. Click enter. See, it is directly opening login page. So customer cannot access the test API 1 URL directly. They cannot access. Click enter. So it is not allowing to access. So it is expecting authentication. Why? Because this API we have declared it as a must authenticated. Similarly, let me try test API 2 as well. So test API 2. So let me open new browser. Same browser also we can try. To differentiate that, I'm just showing that. So slash, I'm trying to access test API 2 as well. Click enter. See, it is not allowing me to access directly. It is expecting authentication. Without authentication it will not access. That API cannot be accessed. So now let me try test API 3. So test API 3 we have declared it as a permit all. Permit all nothing but, so whatever all APIs which have declared with request matches, these APIs do not need authentication. Let's try this test API 3 API or web URL. So just go to browser and open new browser, or let's try slash test API. Click enter. See, if you observe here, test API is directly accessed. So test API 3 authenticate not authenticated without let me to avoid confusion. So test API 1 accessed without authentication. Accessed without sorry, HTTP1 accessed with authentication. This should be with authentication, right? With authentication. And this one also HTTP2 with authentication. And test API 3 without authentication. Test API 4 also without authentication. That's it. So now you can easily understand. Now let me try to access again test API 1. What will happen if you try to access test API 1? So according to our configuration, test API 1 and test API 2 both should be authenticated. So let me try test API 1 again. Click enter. It is directly logging web page. Let me type enter credentials Java cafeteria and test is the password. Click on login. See, test API 1 accessed with authentication. So similarly, let me try second API test API 2 as well. This is also must authenticated. So let me try another browser and try to access it. Test API 2, click enter with authentication. Why? Because earlier we already logged in, right? So that is the reason it is directly taking test API 2. We already logged in again earlier. Let me delete the cookies. So what will happen? Any one time if you log in, it will not ask second time. So test API, see, test API is also not authenticate, allowing to access directly. So now test API 1 also, now test API 1 also will not access directly. So both are showing login page. So let me test API 3. Go to test API 3. If you try to access test API 3, this API doesn't need authentication. Why? Because our custom class we have declared permit all. So this API is no need authentication. Go to browser and type it here. Click enter. See, test API 3 without authentication. Let me try test API 4 as well. So test API 3 without authentication. Test API 4. Click enter. Test API 4 also without authentication. So we can customize which API should authenticate and which API should not authenticate by using authenticated method on permit all. And there is another method denying all as well. So we can deny request. So login page also will not come. So how they just copy paste. So let me remove this API from, or else we have already few APIs, right? So let me, there is a save user API also. What I will do, let me copy save user API, and this save user API I don't want to provide him access to our web application. Save user and just remove any API, guys. So this I want to deny. Let me stop the server, later I will start. So here dot, there is a method called deny all. See, deny all. So we are denying what are all the APIs. If you declare a request method, those APIs, they cannot, they will never access login page also. So we are denying everything. So control C, and then now let's try directly. If you access save user, what will happen, we'll see. Click on enter. See, this website cannot, this site cannot be reached, right? So we are denying at all. So sorry, let me, sorry, server is not started, that's the reason cannot be reached came. So let me start the server. The server started successfully. Now let me try to access save user. This save user API, we are denying it. So now save user API, click enter. See what you got. So login page. Why? See, it is not authentic. Let me clear the browser cookies and let me try again. Save user. See, without authenticating, let me check why it is showing directly. So because this is save user post method, right? That's the reason. Since it is a post method, so save user method, if you see, save user method is a post request. That is the reason it is directly trying to authenticate. So let me, if you try to authenticate that, that's the reason. Since it is a post method, it's directly opening login page. So let me open. If you try to log in, what will happen, you will see Java cafeteria. It will not provide you access to that URL. Java cafeteria, and try entering test. See, you got the bad credentials. Okay, Java cafeteria and test is the password. Click on sign in button. See, access to local host is denied. So save user method nobody cannot access. It is saying access to local host is denied. So 403 error. So it is denied. So this method, save user method, if you're trying to access, since it is a post method, it is showing login page. Let me try this test 4 method. We'll see what will happen. Let me add test 4 method here. test test 4 API method to deny. So here we have to remove. So I am removing it here. I am giving test API 4 method to don't access it, deny it directly. So now copy this test 4 method. What will happen, we'll see. Click enter. See, it is directly not opening login page. Why? Because so still server is in starting mode. So let me start and stop again since class is modified. So let me start again. If you directly access test API 4, then it should deny the request. It should not open login page also. Since it is a get request, it will not allow. Click enter. See, access to local host. What is happening? Test API for denying all. Denied. So test API, yeah, it is showing test API 4 also deny. Test API 4 is a get request, right? test API 4. Let me check. Yeah, it is a get request API, and it is that API they cannot access any API. You must authenticate first. So let me authenticate now. So Java cafeteria, and then try test and click on sign in. See, it is not showing the message. Earlier what it is used to show test API without authentication, but now it is trying to add with authentication, but we are denying it. Access to localhost was denied. This test API 4 is also denied, so they cannot access it. So if I remove it from here, testing purpose, what I will do again, I will remove from here and I will add it here again. So what will happen? Now they can access directly. Click on enter. See, test API, what is happening? So still server is starting. So let me enter. See, test API 4 without authentication. So like this you can provide access to specific API, whether it is able to access by authentication or those APIs can access without authentication. We can customize. This is how we can customize in our custom security configuration. Very very easy guys. This is very basic concept you have to understand to learn advanced concept. Before learning advanced concept of string security, you must understand basic concepts like you should have capability to provide access to specific APIs, and also you should have capability to provide without authentication and with authentication, and denying all nothing but even if you log in you cannot access specific URLs, right? So this is how you can practice it guys. Very very easy. So now here actually if you observe here, the moment you log in here again, if you try test API, let me try with authentication first. So test API 1, let me try to access test API 1. See, test API 1 is already access with authentication. Why? Because earlier I already logged in. If you observe, sir, so when I am trying to log in first time, user is able to with access without sorry with authentication only user should access. Second time when I tried, it is not opening login page. Why? Because you already authenticated. So how it is handling by Spring Security, I will explain you in next lecture. Okay, we'll go step by step so that you can easily understand. So in next lecture we can enhance this code as well. So this is showing deprecated, right? So we can enhance with the latest advanced code in next lecture, and also we can discuss how Spring Security is authenticating. Once you send request multiple time, once you log in first time, it is not asking second time. So how Spring Security is managing credentials in security context, so I will explain you that in next lecture. We'll go step by step guys. You have to keep practice guys. Okay, so let me tell you one more thing. So some people may not remember. If you don't understand this concept, right, there is another way also we can copy this code. How we can copy this code? So there is a, so okay, anyway I will explain in next lecture that one guys. Thank you so much. Who are all watching newly, you can uh, subscribe Java Cafeteria channel or Java Palace channel. You can learn Spring Boot from scratch. You can understand very easily. You can learn very easily by coding it. Okay. Okay, guys.